Office Depot for your micro purchases. One day you go to Staples. Another day you go to Office Max, right? You just spread it out. That's all. If you spread it out, you're not going to the same place. It's under $3,000. Go for it. You don't have to go through any competition, any competitive process. I wanted to, though, remind you, the micro purchases, this is new. This does not apply until those July 1, 2015 awards. And for our post-secondary folks, it might not apply till July 1, 2016, right? So keep that in mind before you just start spending under micro purchases and tell the state it's no problem.
But Bonnie, what if Office Depot is always cheaper than Office Max and Staples?
So the question is, well, what if Office Depot is always the cheapest, right? And Staples and Office Max are more expensive. The thought process behind micro purchases is that they're the type of purchases that are not that don't differ largely by price, like paper or other kind of small supplies, and the federal requirements say to go spread it out. Now, if you know that one is cheaper than the other and you can show that, then absolutely go to the cheaper one and just include some documentation, and that's fine. Then you're consistent with your small purchase requirements because you got a quote or two in there, right? But the idea behind not obtaining quotes, not having to worry about it, is that you can just go out to multiple vendors and make a purchase. And yes? Right. Great question. So just in case you didn't hear over here, what about our state contracts that, vendors that are contracted with the state and then we use them and we know that, that is fine. What typically happens when that is set up is that the state went through a procurement process and competed with multiple vendors and found the best vendor for a period of time, let's say 5 years, and they enter into an open contract with that vendor for that 3-year period or that 5-year period, and then all of the subgrantees can take advantage of that competition that was done, and they would use that particular vendor. Totally fine. Consistent with procurement because the state went through the procurement process to set up that open contract, right? So it's really a competitive process or a sealed process that the state already went through. And absolutely you can use that without shopping around or getting quotes, et cetera. Any other questions on procurement? The one I want to talk about the most is the sole source. And the reason I love to bring up the sole source is because everyone wants to use a sole source arrangement, right? Everybody says that they want to use this. And you know what? Every vendor you meet tells you, I am the only vendor that can provide you with this service, right? I am the only one. I have a sole source letter for you. I will write this sole source letter for you. I will give it to you. I guarantee you there's no competition. I am totally good. You can sole source with me. Don't worry about procurement, right? I see it all the time. I hear it from our clients all the time. And I tell you what, a sole source arrangement is a red flag for any auditor or any monitor that comes in. And you are hard pressed to win that fight to say that there was no other competitor that could have bid or competed with that particular contract. The only times I have ever seen a sole source arrangement fly or work have been really subsequent to an actual authentic procurement. So, for example, you compete out a new software system, you go through competitive process, you select your software system, you implement that software system. 2 years later, you need to get an upgrade. You have to go back to that same provider for the upgrade to your system, or you would have to get a whole new system, right? In that circumstance, I have seen the sole source arrangement be fine because it's really a comparison of adding an upgrade or implementing a whole new system. Otherwise, public emergency, you can get a non-competitive contract. Another point that actually was clarified in the new regulations is if you have awarding agency approval. So you can use a non-competitive contract with awarding agency approval. Well, the question came up, if I, in my grant application, name a vendor and my application is approved, do I have awarding agency approval to then contract with that vendor without going through procurement? And I'll tell you what, it was a debate within even my firm as to whether or not that would count. Well, the new regulations now say no. You have to have a specific request. You can't just try and slide it into your grant application, right? And just see if it gets through and you're fine and then, oh, yeah, look, it was in our application. We said we've used them. It's the sole source, right? No, no, no. Now you have to have a very specific request to your awarding agency and get written authorization before you have that awarding agency approval to use a non-competitive procurement process. Questions on procurement? Another distinction to sort of highlight here is the relationship between a contract and a grant, and that's in current rules, it's in new rules, and the reason it's important is because if you are a grantee or a sub-grantee, then you are subject to all of the rules in EDGAR, right? Everything in EDGAR applies to you. You have a legal relationship to those funds. You are subject to all the regulations, rules, requirements, etc. If you are a contractor, you are only subject to the rule or to what's written in your contract, right? A contractor only has to comply with the contract. A grantee or sub-grantee has to comply with all of the regulations and program statutes, etc., that are applicable for that particular funding stream. So that's why the distinction is important. If you, as a sub-grantee, want to impose some of the regulatory requirements onto your contractors, so for example, you want to contract with an agency to provide tutors, and you want to ask those tutors to provide time and effort documentation or some sort of time log that shows what they're doing, that's fine. Just make sure it's written in the contract, right? It's not that you can simply say, well, we're paying you with Perkins funds, you have to do this. No, no, they only have to do what's written in their contract. If you want them to follow these, certain regulations or requirements, well, then just make sure that you reference it and put it into the contract. I mentioned at the beginning that the new regulations, there's a few losers, right? And I said pass-through agencies are really the losers of the new regs. And that's just because they've gotten a lot of additional requirements added onto them. So pass-through entity is the non-federal entity that provides a sub-reward to your sub-recipient. So for purposes here, it's the state. It's PED, right? The monitoring of, so current requirements in 80.40 and 74.32 for post-secondary is that the pass-through entity has oversight and they must monitor compliance and performance, right? So I mentioned this at the beginning. Our pass-through entities, the state, they are required to monitor you. It's not something that they necessarily want to do. It's a requirement of them. They are ultimately responsible for those grant funds. As part of that responsibility, they have to monitor their sub-grantees, and they have to make sure that they're spending those funds in compliance. They also have to monitor your performance. That exists in current rules. That exists in the new rules. What's new, though, is that now pass-through entities have to conduct a risk analysis on all of their sub-grantees, which means that they have to determine who their risky sub-grantees are versus their less risky sub-grantees. Risk factors are included in the regulations, and that includes experience with the program. So if you are a brand new Perkins recipient, well, then you are going to be considered of a higher risk than someone that's been running a CTE program for years and years and administering these funds, right? Previous audits, that's including your single audits, that's your monitoring reports, that's any OIG audits that you've had, any audits that are relevant. If you have a lot of findings and issues in those audit reports, well then, of course, you're going to be of greater risk. If you have new personnel, how many of you